In this lecture, we'll be looking at examples of early classical sculpture and discussing how things shift from the characteristics of the archaic period to this early classical moment. I'm showing you here fragments that have survived from the Temple of Zeus at Olympia, which was built in around 460 BCE. The Temple of Zeus was placed in the sanctuary of Hera and Zeus on Olympia, and it was a Doric temple that obviously does not survive anymore. The temple itself was constructed of local stone, but it was decorated with sculptures that were made of imported marble. And here we're looking at the west pediment. And you can see that the sculptures are sculptures in the round. They are not high relief. In fact, they are so high relief, they've now broken free from their flat background. So like the sculptures of the dying warriors that we saw at the Temple of Athea, they are now sculptures in the round that rest on kind of a shelf or a platform that was high above the temple facade, above the columns. And we can see that the artists have created a composition that can nicely fit into that very awkward, shallow triangle that is presented by a pediment. The themes of this temple were Apollo, Zeus, and Athena. And we can see that in the west pediment, Apollo himself stands in that place of hieratic importance at the center, towering above all of the other figures. He stands there very stoic and calm and rational, and this is in stark contrast to the chaos that seems to be unfolding on either side of him. The story that is presented is from Greek mythology, and it is the conflict between the Lapiths and the Centaurs. And the Centaurs are half human, half horse creatures, and the Lapiths are a Greek clan. So already we see a matchup between the rationality of the Greeks, the Lapiths, and the kind of animal nature and irrationality of the Centaurs, who are, after all, half beast. And we should recognize that the Centaurmachy, much like any battle scene that would be happening in a mythological battle scene that would be happening in the sculptural program of a Greek temple, is a metaphor for something else. In this case, we can assume that the metaphor represents the civilized versus the barbarians, because the Lapiths are, after all, a Greek clan, so they represent rationality, and the barbarians are, of course, anyone who is not Greek and therefore are inferior. And given the political moment that is just following the conquering of the Persians by the Greeks, we could also see a political metaphor in which the Lapiths represent the Athenians and the Centaurs represent the Persians. So what is this mythological narrative? The Lapiths wanted to plan a wedding, or rather the head of the Lapiths wanted to plan a wedding for his daughter. And he knew that the guests, if the Centaurs were guests, the wedding would spin out of control because they were not good guests. They were rowdy, they tended to drink too much, and they often went after the women. So he did not invite them to the wedding, but of course they showed up anyway. And the Centaurs came and busted up the good time. They were drunk and rude and tried to carry off some of the Lapith women. And so we see these really fascinating and interesting figural uh, um, combinations of a beast, the hindquarters of a horse, and hands encircling women as they try and push away the centaurs. Here's a really good, um, interesting combination of this woman who is trying to push away or hitting a head of a centaur as he tries to lift her and carry her off. So we see figures that are twisting and writhing and struggling in really fascinating ways in this composition, and all, of course, in contrast to the rationality and calmness of the central figure of Apollo. But all of this movement gives the artists the opportunity to very gracefully fit all of these figures into the architectural framework of the pediment, of that triangular frame. So we no longer have to shrink down figures in a very awkward way, like we saw with the Temple of Athena, in which we saw Medusa in the center in the hieratic scale, but then we saw figures in the corners that were in a completely different proportion. Now everyone is more or less the same size, but they are crouching and lying down and twisting in positions that fit them into the place in the triangle where they exist. In the middle of the whole scene is Apollo. He shows up and he says to everyone, calm down. He's trying to break up the fight. And as you do when you try and break up a fight, you are rational, calm, and you push the two sides away from each other. And so in the middle of all of this disorder, we see a figure who is standing there in a very calm way, looking much in a way like a Kouros figure in his verticality. But what is characteristic of the early classical period is that we are now seeing an activation of the anatomy that allows for a twisting effect. So his head is pushing one way, turning one way, while the weight is shifting to the other side. And so we see this very gentle movement that activates all of his muscles and show him as very lifelike, but at the same time idealized. Apollo's figure is very much displaying that activation and that breath of life that we see as we shift from the archaic period into the classical period. His weight is shifting from one leg onto the other, which activates everything else in his figure. We see one elbow that is ever so slightly bent, and his head is shifting in the other direction. So we have a sense of balance and counterbalance, a sense of ever so slightly activating the muscles in order to show life, but in a way that seems very calm and rational. This seems like a big leap when we look back to the Kouros that we discussed in the archaic period. I'm showing you here on the right a figure called the Kritios boy that was found in the Acropolis in Athens. This is thought to be the first occurrence of the position that we call contrapposto, and you'll hear more about this in the next video. But contrapposto refers to this shift in weight from one foot to another that activates the entire body. And so what we have is a zigzag effect coming from one shoulder to the other, down to one hip, down to the other hip, and then down to the knee. And contrapposto means counterbalance, or literally counterpoise. And it refers to the human figure standing again with its weight on mostly on one foot, so the shoulders and arms twist off axis. And if you compare it to the Kouros, the figure is now breaking free from that stark symmetry that we see in the archaic period. We also see more of a reference to anatomy. So that very hard geometric anatomy that we see in the Kouros figure is now added to the point that we see kind of the softness of a fleshy figure. And we see musculature that is not linear, but rather has 3 dimensions. Now, this seems like a huge leap when we look at a sculpture from 600 to that early moment of 480 in the early classical period. Perhaps we need a missing link. And for that, we might look to the Kroisos from about 530 BCE, which can be seen really as an intermediary figure. He still has that symmetry of the archaic period. We even see a bit of that archaic smile and the stylized hair that we often see during the archaic period. But certainly there is more musculature here. He has, his thighs are swollen and more muscular. We see much more of a definition of his chest muscles and his abdominal muscles. We see real biceps and forearms. Even though he is clenching his fist downwards in that kind of very Egyptian way, his arms aren't rigid. They aren't rigidly falling down, but rather have a slight bend to the elbow that gives him a bit of softness. So then we shift to the Croesus boy. And we see, again, the softness of that anatomy coming through, a 3-dimensionality of the musculature and the tendons. But we also see now an activation of those muscles thanks to that contrapposto pose. We see the reaction to that action. So one little shift in the weight from one foot to another creates this ever so slight asymmetry that gives the sense of life to the figure.